My son writes to me every spring.
This handwriting is not a dead man's, ma'am.
Every figure he's given you is true.
It's thin, Abigail. That was all the postmistress said, and she said it low, so the two farmers warming their hands at the stove would not turn around. Nell Prue held the envelope out across the counter with 2 fingers, the way you hold a thing you would rather not be the one to hand over. Winter light came grey through the front glass of the Cottonwood Bend post office. On the envelope was a government franc and a smear of a postmark, and Abigail Merrill's name in a clerk's indifferent hand. The thick ones, Nell said, are the ones that come home. Furloughs, back pay. A thick envelope means a man's coming home. She did not finish the other half of it. She did not have to. Every mother in Kansas had learned that winter to read the weight of a letter before she read the words. The thin ones were from the War Department. The thin ones were notices. Abigail took it. She did not open it. She stood in the middle of the floor with her thumb against the flap and did not open it, and the whole small room seemed to wait with her. Here is the thing you would have missed if you had been one of those farmers by the stove. When the notice came, the town of Cottonwood Bend did what towns do. The men looked at their boots. The minister's wife looked at the ceiling. Everyone in that post office found somewhere else to put their eyes, because a woman opening a War Department letter is a private thing done in public, and decent people look away from it. Everyone but Nell Prue. Behind the counter, the postmistress stood square and did not turn her face. Her right hand, the middle finger stained black to the knuckle from 30 years of sorting other people's mail, the skin gone hard as a saddle, closed slowly around the edge of the counter and gripped it white, as though the oak might bolt. She watched Abigail Merrill the way you watch someone step out onto thin ice. She was the only soul in the room who did not look away. No one saw it. Remember it anyway. Remember that she was the one who did not look away. This story will ask you for it before the end. You should know who it was, standing on that floor with an unopened letter. Abigail Merrill had been a widow once already. Her husband Eli had died of a burst appendix 4 years before the first shot at Sumter. Died on his own kitchen table under a doctor who could do nothing but hold his hand. And she had learned then that the Lord takes with both hands and does not always give his reasons. After Eli, there had been the farm and the boy, and that was the whole of the world. 80 acres of Kansas sod, and one son named Caleb. Caleb Merrill was 21 years old. He had his mother's hazel eyes and his father's shoulders, and a way of writing letters that made her laugh out loud in an empty house. Long letters, full of the doings of his company. The mule that stole his hat, the Georgia rain. He had gone for a soldier in the last year of the war, when the thing was all but decided, because a neighbor boy went, and he would not be left behind. He signed his letters the same way every time. Your son, Caleb. Never anything grander than that. The thin envelope in her hands had come to tell her there would be no more of them. When she finally opened it, not there but at home, at her own table, with the door shut, it said what the thin ones all said. Killed in action. It named a place in Georgia she had never heard of and would never see. It regretted. It was signed by a clerk of the War Department, who had signed 400 that week, and would sign 400 more. The town was kind for a while. That is the honest truth. And it must be set down. The women brought what women bring. The minister came and sat and spoke of the resurrection and the life and meant it. For 2 weeks the Merrill place was not a lonely place. But a town has only so much grief to spend, and it had spent a great deal that year. Cottonwood Bend sent 11 boys to the war, and got 7 of them back, and 4 mothers cannot all be tended forever. By the 3rd week the covered dishes stopped coming. The last of them was a pan of scalloped potatoes from the Kellermans, and Abigail washed the pan and set it on her doorstep to be reclaimed, and no one ever came for it, and it sat out there through 3 snows. By the 4th week the path to her door had gone back to grass under the drifts. This is not cruelty. It is only how the living close ranks and go on, and turn their faces toward the ones they can still save. But it left a woman alone in a house built for 3, in the dead middle of a Kansas winter, with nothing at all coming up the road to her. What a house does to a person left alone in it, in winter, is a slow thing, and it does it quietly. She set the table for one and could not get used to it. Her hands kept laying 2 places, and every night she carried the 2nd plate back to the shelf. She stopped winding the clock, because the ticking in an empty house is a cruel sound. She let the calendar hang on its nail at January and did not turn the page, because the pages ahead were only a list of days she would have to get through, and she saw no reason to count them out in advance. She ate less. She measured the flour with her eye each morning, and took a little less than the day before. She talked to the cow, and to the stove, and once, catching herself, to the empty chair across the table, and did not finish the sentence. On the coldest nights, she slept in her chair by the stove, rather than face the cold sheets of a bed made for 2. She was not, she would have told you, unwell. She was only going out, the way a lamp goes out when no one trims it. Not broken, not blown, just lower and lower for want of tending. That was the winter of 1865. And then the ground thawed. It was the last week of April, the redbuds just breaking pink along the creek, when Nell Prue looked up from her sorting and went very still. There was a letter in the Merrill box. She turned it over once. The direction was written in a careful, upright hand. Mrs. Abigail Merrill, Cottonwood Bend, Kansas. And the paper was cheap and yellowed, and the postmark was a grey thumbprint that told you nothing at all. She held it a moment longer than a postmistress holds a letter. Then she set it on the counter, face up, and waited. Abigail came in on the Saturday for the flour and the little that 30 cents would buy. Nell did not say anything. She only slid the letter across the counter, the way she had slid the thin one across in the winter, and watched. Abigail looked down at it. She saw the hand. And the strangest thing happened to her face. The color came back into it all at once, the way it comes into the sky before the sun is even up. She put one papery hand flat on the counter to hold herself steady. "Postmarked where, Nell?" she whispered. Nell looked at the grey smear as though studying it. "Can't rightly say. Mud on the stamp." She did not wait to get home. She went out of the post office and into the mud of the main street. And she stood there, in the thaw, with the wagons going around her. And she broke the seal with her thumb, and read her son's letter, standing up in the middle of Cottonwood Bend. Dear Ma. It began the way they had all begun. it was sorry to have worried her. It had been a long, hard march, and the mails were a shambles. But he was well. She was not to fret. There was a mule in it, and a card game, and a sergeant from Ohio who sang. It asked after the cow. It asked whether the redbuds were out yet, because he could not stand to miss them twice. It was signed the way they were all signed. Your son, Caleb. A woman standing in a road reading a letter is the commonest sight in the world. And not one of the men driving around her that morning knew they were looking at a resurrection. She read it 3 times before she moved. Then she folded it along its creases and put it inside her shawl against her heart, and walked home with her back straight for the first time since January. Now you are already asking the question the whole town would come to ask. You are asking how. Hold on to it. This story will answer you in its own time, and the answer is not the one you are reaching for. For now, set the how aside and look instead at what the letter did, because that is the true subject here, and the how is only the machinery underneath. It brought her back. That is what it did. A woman who had been quietly going out was lit again from the inside. She turned the calendar to May. She wound the clock. She set the table for one without flinching, because now the one was waiting on the other, on the next letter, whenever it should come. She planted her garden. She mended the fence. She went to church and sang. And that spring, sitting at her own table by lamplight, Abigail Merrill did a thing she would do every year after. She took a clean sheet of paper and dipped her pen and wrote back, "Dear Caleb." She told him the redbuds were out. She told him the cow was fine. Then she folded her answer and sealed it, and could not send it, for there was nowhere on this earth to send it to. So she kept it. She would keep all of them. Kietzitie, Hanjul, Naratoton, Chot Pyeonji, Peyo Pujiku. If quiet, forgotten kindnesses are the reason you're here, take a moment to follow along. This channel is built out of them. The letters came every spring after that, and never in any other season. Never in summer, never at Christmas, never in the hard heart of winter when she wanted them most. Only in spring, always in spring, as though the boy could only get one out when the ground gave up its frost. She learned the rhythm of it and lived by it. She measured her whole year against it now. Winter was the long dark before. Summer and fall the slow keeping of the last one. And April the turning of the wheel. By the second year she had a place at the window where she would sit through late April with her mending, watching the road, jumping at every rider. And Nell Prue, over in town, got into the habit of walking the spring letter, the mile out to the creek herself, rather than make the old woman wait. Or worse, come in and find it not yet there. It was the only errand in 30 years that the postmistress ever ran for a living soul, and the town, if it noticed at all, put it down to pity. By the 5th spring there were letters enough to tie together, and Abigail tied them with a ribbon, a length of sky blue silk cut from an old bonnet, because blue had been the color of Caleb's regiment, and she thought he would like it. She untied the ribbon to add each new one, and read the old ones through from the start every spring, so that the earliest letters grew soft as cloth along their folds. So the years folded, the way years do. You cannot see them pass while you are inside them, only afterward, all at once, by some plain object that has quietly grown old in your hands. For Abigail, the object was the bundle. By the 11th spring it had grown thick as a Bible, and the sky blue ribbon had faded almost to white, and pressed inside the oldest letter was a prairie violet gone to paper. kept from that first April in the road. 11 springs. She was an old woman now. Her hair had gone to silver and her hands to paper. And the boy in the letters was still 21, still asking after the cow, still hoping he had not missed the redbuds twice. She never once remarked on that. A mother who has lost a son and been given his letters back does not go looking in the gift for the place where it does not add up. Or, and hold this thought, for the story will come back for it. Perhaps she had looked long ago and found the place and decided that the gift was worth a great deal more than the arithmetic. The town, of course, talked. A town always talks. It is how a town thinks out loud. At first they talked kindly. Poor Abigail, the women said over their fences. Poor thing, she keeps up a little pretend with a boy's old letters, and where's the harm? Grief takes people queer, and it's a gentle queerness, not like some. They said it the way you would speak of a woman who set a plate for the dead. It cost them nothing, and they meant it soft. But a gentle story wears thin with repeating, and by the 5th or 6th spring, the kindness had a burr in it. Because now they were noticing. Now the sharper ones, the ones who counted things, were saying over those same fences, but where do they come from? 11 years the boy's been in the Georgia ground, and every April, a fresh letter in his name. Who's mailing them? And nobody had an answer. And a town with no answer will always in the end reach for the unkind one. By the 10th spring the children had a rhyme for her. They would follow a little way behind when she walked to town for her letter, chanting the way children chant the cruel things they have overheard from grown people and do not understand. A rhyme about the letter lady and her ghost, and they would scatter laughing when she turned. She never chased them. She would only stop and look at them and go on, and something in the looking made the oldest of them uneasy in a way they could not have named. And the grown people. The grown people had settled by then on the phrase that let them stop thinking about it. Poor mad Abigail Merrill, they said, and having said mad, they were excused from wondering any further. For a mad woman's letters explain themselves and require nothing of the neighbors but a shake of the head. They were wrong about her. She was the sanest soul in that county. And if she had come to understand more about those letters than she ever let the town see, she kept it the way she kept the letters themselves, folded and close and to herself. But we are getting ahead of the story again. Say what the town said. The letters made a life, and it was not a pretend one. She farmed her 80 acres into her 60s, alone, and made them pay. She was first to every sickbed in the county, this woman they called mad, and sat the nights that other people would not sit. She taught the little ones their letters at the church of a Sunday, taught half of Cottonwood Bend to read and write. In fact, which is a thing to hold in your mind for later. She was not a broken woman keeping a sad little secret. She was a whole woman keeping a great one, and every spring she wrote back. That was the part no one saw. She answered every letter, "Dear Caleb, the red buds are out," and sealed each answer, and could not mail it, because the letters that came to her carried no return address anywhere in the world. So she kept her answers in a second bundle, tied with a second ribbon, and never spoke of them. A woman writing letters she cannot send is either the loneliest creature on the prairie, or she is speaking, deliberately and with her eyes open, to someone she is quite certain is listening. The town was sure it knew which. The town was wrong about that too. And all this time, 30 feet from the mailboxes, behind a counter worn smooth by her own forearms, stood Nell Prue. She had kept the Cottonwood Bend post office for 30 years and told nobody one thing about herself in all that time. She had come from somewhere east alone. She had never married. She lived in the 2 small rooms behind the office and was thought by those who thought about her at all to be cold. She did not go to the socials. She did not sit with the women. She sorted the mail with a speed and a silence that discouraged conversation. And her one visible tenderness, the letter she carried out to the creek each spring. The town chalked up to pity for a mad woman, and let alone. Only one thing about her invited a question, and no one ever asked it. Late at night, long after the office was dark, a single light burned in the back window of the post office. A candle, by the look of it, set low on a desk. Some nights it burned nearly to dawn. Folks passing it on their way home from the Silver Spur figured the postmistress kept accounts or couldn't sleep, or was simply one of those solitary souls who sit up with a lamp for company. They were not curious. She had given them 30 years of no reason to be. What she did back there alone, by that one candle, the story is nearly ready to tell you, but not quite yet. And so it went, spring after spring, in a town that had stopped asking. That is the thing about a mystery a town lives beside for 11 years. It stops being a mystery and becomes a fixture, like the war memorial on the square, or the price of dry goods, a thing everyone knows and no one examines. The letter came in April. Poor Mad Abigail read it. Nell carried it out. The red buds bloomed and faded. The town had folded the strange thing up small and put it away on a high shelf, and there it might have stayed, unopened, until both those women were in the ground. And this would have been a quieter story, and a kinder one, and no one outside Cottonwood Bend would ever have heard it. But the mail is a federal business, and the government keeps its own accounts, in its own time, and does not much care how long a town has made its peace with a thing. In the 12th spring, the government sent a man. He came up the thaw-muddy road from the rail depot in a black hired coach on a grey morning in April, and everything about him was straight lines, straight-backed on the seat, a dark navy coat with 2 rows of brass buttons done up to the throat, a leather satchel across his chest, heavy with ledgers, small round spectacles, and behind them a pair of tired brown eyes that had learned to trust paper because people had disappointed them. He carried a letter of authority from the post office department, and a list of questions, and the particular patience of a man who has never once been talked out of a discrepancy. Inside the post office, Nell Prue stood at her counter with the day's mail half sorted and a brass cancelling stamp in her ink-stained hand. Through the front glass, she watched the black coach come up the street and stop, and watched the straight-backed man climb down and check the number over the door against something written in his book. Her stamp came down on a letter, and then it did not come down again. Her hand simply stopped in the air above the ink pad and stayed there. The government had finally come asking after the thing the town had long ago stopped questioning. 11 years of spring mail, the inspector said, from a man the War Department buried in the spring of 1865. He had laid his hat on Nell Prue's counter and his ledger beside it, and opened the ledger to a page he had already marked. He did not raise his voice. He was, if anything, courteous, a courtesy with no warmth in it, the courtesy of a man reading you your position. "Either the department is mistaken about the death of Corporal Caleb Merrill," he said, "or the mails of the United States have carried something they ought not to have carried. I mean to learn which. My name is Everett Dunn. I am a special agent of the Post Office Department, and I would be obliged, ma'am, for the loan of your records." Nell Prue looked at him a long moment. Then she turned and took her ledgers down off the shelf and set them on the counter between them, squared to the edge, and said the only thing she would say freely in the whole affair. "Take whatever you need, Mr. Dunn. It's the government's paper. Always was." It would be easy to make Everett Dunn the villain of this story, and it would be a lie. He was not a cruel man. He was something the prairie found harder to forgive, an orderly one. He believed in the mails the way other men believe in scripture, believed that a letter posted in Boston and a letter posted in a Kansas cow town were owed the identical faith, the identical safe passage, and that the whole fragile marvel of it held together only because men like him refused to make exceptions. He had seen what exceptions did. He had spent 20 years chasing men who traded on other people's trust, pension swindlers, lottery frauds, men who mailed ruin to widows in the shape of hope. And he had learned to distrust a kind story most of all, because a kind story was the swindler's finest tool. He was also, though he told no one this, a man who went home to empty rooms. Somewhere in Everett Dunn's past, there was a mother, and a distance, and a letter, and he did not speak of it. He put his faith in the ledger, because the ledger, at least, had never once let him down. Keep that in mind. The story will need it before the end. He worked for 3 days, and he worked the way water works at a riverbank, steadily without heat, finding every seam. He took down the cancelling records and the distribution ledgers and the registered mail book. He laid out 11 years of the Merrill correspondence, for Nell had kept careful note of every letter received into that box, as a good postmistress must, and he built his own tables from them. Date received, postmark, where legible, point of origin as claimed. He worked at a plank table by the window and did not stop for the dinner the landlady left cooling at his elbow. He was neat. He wrote in a small, exact hand and ruled his columns with a straight edge. And where a fact would not sit still, he wrote it down anyway, in its own column, to be answered later. By the end of the 3rd day he had made, out of 11 years of one town's mail, a picture no one in Cottonwood Bend had ever stood far enough back to see. And the picture was wrong. It was wrong in a way that put a cold hand on the back of his neck, sitting there in the lamplight of a rented room. Because Everett Dunn had caught a great many liars in his time, and not one of them had ever lied quite like this. The letters came from nowhere. He meant that precisely. The postmarks, where he could read them at all, were smudged past use, every one of them, 11 years of them, as though the ink had always chanced to blur on just that spot. But a letter does not need a legible postmark to be traced, if a man is patient. It needs only a point of origin, and the origins were named inside the letters themselves. A camp in Georgia, a hospital in Tennessee, a mustering station in the spring of 1865. Dunn wrote to them all. And the answers came back over the weeks, in the dry hands of other clerks in other offices, and every answer said the same thing in different words. No such soldier, no such posting. The camp had been struck in 1865 and the ground ploughed under. The hospital had burned. One clock in Nashville wrote back that the ward the letters named had been pulled down for its lumber the very spring they claimed to be written from it. And Dunn sat with that reply a long moment, for it was the neatest kind of impossible. A letter mailed each April from a building that no longer stood. The man these letters claimed to come from had been dead 11 years, and every place they claimed to be written from had ceased, one way or another, to exist. The letters had no home anywhere in the world. And yet, every April, they arrived. So he began to ask the town, and the town gave him the strangest set of answers he had ever entered in a ledger. He started with the blacksmith, a broad, slow man named Amos Teague, because a blacksmith hears everything. Dunn asked him plainly, did he know where Widow Merrill's letters came from? Teague set down his hammer and thought about it with his whole face, the way big men think, and finally said, come every spring, Mr. Dunn, long as I can recollect. Redbud's and Abigail's letter, that's how a body knows it's April. And when Dunn pressed him, but who sends them, man? A dead soldier cannot post a letter. The blacksmith only shrugged his great shoulders, not troubled in the least, and said, couldn't tell you. Never seemed my business to work out. He got the same answer at the mercantile, and the church, and the mill, worn to different shapes, but the same answer underneath. Nobody knew. And this was the part that unsettled the orderly man. Nobody minded not knowing. He would explain to them carefully that a fraud was very likely being worked upon a grieving old woman, that someone was trading on her sorrow, and he would watch the words fail to land. They did not see a fraud. They saw Abigail's letter. For us, it's the calendar, Inspector, the miller's wife told him, hanging out her wash. The war took a piece out of this town you can't hardly measure. That one letter every spring. I don't know who sees to it, and I've quit asking the Lord why he allows a mercy. You might try quitting too. Dunn wrote it all down, and the more he wrote, the plainer it became that he was the only man in the county who wished to know. It was not that they lied to him, a lie he could have broken open in an afternoon. It was that they had, without ever meeting to decide it, agreed to leave one stone in the field unturned. He did not yet understand that the town was not hiding the answer from him. The town simply loved the mercy more than it wanted the fact. And in that, though he would have bristled to hear it, the town was some distance ahead of him. It was the handwriting that broke it open in the end, because handwriting was the one witness that could not shrug. Dunn requisitioned from the War Department the service papers of Corporal Caleb Merrill, the enlistment oath, the pay vouchers, a furlough request, all of it signed in the young man's own hand in 1864 and 1865. It took a month for the packet to come west, and it was a hard month for a man who liked to close a thing once he had opened it. He filled the waiting with the town, and the town, being kind to him without meaning to be, only sank the splinter deeper. When the packet finally came, he cleared the table in his rented room, and he set one of Caleb's true letters, begged from Abigail, on the pretext of the investigation, which it was, down beside the enlistment oath. He weighted the corners with 2 river stones so the papers would lie flat. Then he lit both lamps against the failing light and took out the small magnifying glass he carried for exactly this, and bent over the 2 papers to weigh a dead man's hand against a dead man's hand. For a long while he found nothing, and that in itself was remarkable. Whoever had made these letters had made them with terrible care. The slope was right. The capitals were right. Even the spelling was right, down to the boyish errors a forger would have been tempted to correct. Everett Dunn had unmasked a dozen forgers in his time, and he sat there in grudging admiration, because this was the finest hand he had ever examined. He had all but closed the glass and called it genuine when he saw it. The letter T. In the true letters, the young soldier crossed his T's with a quick upstroke, left to right and tailing up, a careless boy's flick. In the 11 years of spring letters, every T was crossed the other way. A firm, level bar, drawn right to left, laid down by a hand that had crossed 10,000 T's and could no longer unlearn the direction. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the one habit the forger's own hand could not surrender, and it was repeated in every letter, for 11 years. A man's hand, Dunn knew, is as much his own as his face. This was not the boy's hand. This was someone else's, holding very still, trying with great love to be his, and failing always, in exactly the same small place. And now the story must do the thing Everett Dunn could not, and go back past the 11 springs, to the slate-grey winter where it started, to a thing that happened in this same post office that no ledger ever recorded. It was the winter of 1865. The thin envelope had come and gone. Abigail Merrill was alone in her cabin, going quietly out like an untended lamp. And one grey afternoon, into the Cottonwood Bend post office, there came a package, travel-stained, much handled, tied with string that had been retied a dozen times on the long road home. It had been mailed by a soldier of Caleb's company, a boy himself, who had carried it in his own kit halfway across the ruined South, rather than trust it to the wartime mails, and who had at the last been too worn down to bring it the final miles in person. Inside were the small things a dead man's mother is sent: a tin cup, a jackknife, a tintype gone to fog, and a letter, and a second, smaller note, folded separate, addressed not to the mother at all. It was addressed to the postmistress. Nell Prue opened it at her counter in the last grey light, and read it standing up, and it changed the whole remainder of her life. The letter inside the parcel was Caleb's last, written to his mother on a board across his knees by firelight. Never sent. The boy had been carrying it when he fell, and his friend had carried it home. But the smaller note was to Nell, in that same boyish hand, and it was short, and it said the thing a dying boy had somehow known to ask of the one person in town, lonely enough to understand the asking. If the worst has come, and you are the one reading this, then I am not coming home to write to her, and there is no one else who will. She has nobody now, but you have the whole town's letters passing through your hands, and I have watched you be kind in the one way you know how, which is on paper. So please, don't let my mother face a spring without a letter. C.M. Nell Prue read it once and read it again, and stood a long time in the dark office with the note in her ink-stained hand. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her walnut desk, the drawer she kept locked, and she laid the note inside and closed it. And that spring, the first letter came. People think a lie is an easy thing to tell. They have never tried to tell a good one for 11 years. That first spring nearly beat her. The story would have you see her on that April night, the candle low, the good paper in front of her, the pen dry in her hand, and no words coming. For she had to be a boy of 21 she had barely known. She had to be easy where she was stiff, warm where 30 years alone had made her guarded. And she had to be his, not hers, had to keep her whole grim self off the page and let only him show through. She sat at that walnut desk until the candle guttered and the window went grey, and she wrote the same first line a dozen ways and fed each one to the stove, until at last, near dawn, she set down 3 words a boy might write, and did not burn them. Dear Ma, I'm well. From there her hand found the road. But it cost her the night, and it would cost her a night every spring for 11 years, and she never once thought the price too high. To write a boy, you must first learn a boy. And Nell Prue said about it the way she did everything, thoroughly and in secret. She got hold of his old school copybooks, borrowing them off Abigail across the years on small honest pretexts, a page at a time. And she studied them at night the way a scholar studies a dead language. She learned his spelling and kept his mistakes. She learned that he wrote fast and crossed nothing out. So she made herself write fast and let her own slip stand. She learned the mule and the sergeant from Ohio who sang out of that one true last letter, and she kept those threads alive year on year, aging them gently. The mule grew old. The sergeant went home to Ohio. The war receded into a soldier's fond and blurring memory. She built a whole living man out of paper and kept him 21 forever. And the only thing of her own she ever let onto the page, the single tell she could never master, was the crossbar of a letter T. And every spring, for 11 springs, the same write in the same back room. The candle, the cheap paper, bought a little at a time so the mercantile would not remark on it. The steel pen, the browning ink, and at the last, the stick of sealing wax softened at the flame. She wrote in April because the boy had asked after the redbuds in his final letter, and she could not make him ask twice. And so she made him a creature of spring forever. And when the letter was sealed and the wax gone hard, Nell Prue would carry her candle to the back window before she slept, the window the whole town wondered at. And she would look out across the dark prairie to where, a mile off at the edge of town, one other light burned late in a cabin by the creek. An old woman up past her hour reading. 2 solitary lights across a mile of dark, and one of them writing to the other, and neither one ever saying so aloud. That was the secret of the postmistress's candle. It was the loneliest kindness in the state of Kansas. When Everett Dunn had his proof, he did the orderly thing and put it to her directly. He came to the counter with the 2 letters and the glass and his ruled tables, and he laid the whole case out between them plank by plank. The vanished origins, the smudged marks, the crossbar of the T. He did not accuse. He simply set the facts down and waited, the way he had waited on 100 guilty men to fill a silence with themselves. Nell Prue looked at his papers. She did not deny one word of it. She did not confess one word of it either. "You've done a deal of arithmetic, Mr. Dunn," she said at last. "I'll not argue a figure of it. But I'll tell you the whole of my job, which I've done 30 years. And it is this. The mail got delivered. Every letter that came into this office reached the hand it was meant for. You go and find me the person who was harmed by it, and I will answer for it. Till then," and she squared her ledgers to the edge of the counter, "you know where I keep the records." It was not a denial. Dunn understood that. It was something worse for his purposes. It was a woman who had weighed the law against the thing she had done, long ago, and made her peace with it, and would not now pretend to be sorry. That night Everett Dunn did not sleep, and he was not a man who lost sleep easily. He had his case. It was, in the language of the statute, a plain thing. To knowingly place in the mails any writing meant to deceive was an offense against the United States, and the statute did not ask the swindler his reasons. Dunn had built cleaner cases on thinner proof and never blinked. And yet the proof sat on his table and would not resolve into the shape it was supposed to take. There was no gain in it. That was the splinter he could not work loose. In 20 years, every fraud he had ever traced ran downhill to money, to something taken from someone. Here, nothing had been taken. A poor postmistress had spent 11 years of her own paper, her own nights, and her own failing eyes to give a broken woman her son back, and had asked nothing in return, and had let the whole town call her cold, and call the widow mad, rather than take the comfort away by explaining herself. He turned it every way a man can turn a thing at 2 a.m, and it came out the same each time. If that was a crime, it was a crime built in the exact shape of its opposite. And Everett Dunn lay awake in the dark and could not find the name for a thing that was against the law and against nothing else on God's earth. But a man is his habits, and Everett Dunn's habit, worn deep by 20 hard years, was to follow the ledger wherever it led. Feeling was not evidence. Mercy was not a defense the statute recognized. He had been sent to find whether the mails had been misused, and they had been. And it was not his office to rule whether the misuse was holy. Some judge might weigh that, not him. So near midnight, he trimmed his lamp and took a fresh sheet of the department's paper and dipped his pen and began, in that small exact hand, every T crossed left to right, the honest way, to write out the charge. In the matter of the United States versus Nell Prue, postmistress of Cottonwood Bend, in the state of Kansas. The pen stopped. It hung over the paper a moment, the way Nell's stamp had hung over the ink the day he came. Everett Dunn looked at the 7 words he had written, and something in him pulled hard the other way. Then he set his jaw and dipped the pen again and went on writing. Fraud. The blacksmith read the word off the notice nailed to the post office door and read it again, as if it might change on a second look. They're calling Nell's letters fraud. A little knot of townspeople had gathered in the April mud to look at the printed sheet. A summons, under a federal seal, calling witnesses to a hearing in the church hall on the last Saturday of the month, in the matter of the misuse of the mails of the United States. Somewhere below the seal was Nell Prue's name, and beside it a word none of them had ever thought to hang on their own quiet spring miracle. The blacksmith took off his hat, which he did not know he was doing. 11 years, he said, to nobody. 11 years that woman gave this town its April, and they've come to put her in a courtroom for it. The notice did to Cottonwood Bend what a hard frost does to a field. It showed all at once what had been growing there unseen. For 11 years the town had held the letters at arm's length, a kindness they took the good of and asked no questions about, a thing they let one lonely woman carry alone. Now the government had put a hard word on it and hung the word on a door, and the town discovered, reading it, that it did not agree. That was the true surprise of that spring. Not the inspector's arithmetic, but the slow turning of a whole town's heart. The way it came around fence by fence and kitchen by kitchen, until by the last Saturday of April, There was hardly a soul in the county who meant to stay home. They did not come to watch Nell Prue tried. They came, though most of them could not have put it into words, to stand up in a room and be counted at last on the side of the mercy they had spent 11 years quietly taking. The church hall was full past its doors and quiet when Everett Dunn rose to lay out the case. He did it fairly. Whatever else the man was, he was fair, and he did not raise his voice or paint the thing blacker than it was. He set his evidence on the long table where the whole room could see. 11 years of letters, and beside them, the dead boy's service papers, his ruled tables of vanished origins, the replies from the burnt hospital and the ploughed under camp, and propped where the lamplight caught it, a card on which he had drawn, very large, the 2-letter T's, the boy's careless upstroke, and the firm level bar that had crossed every letter for 11 years. He walked them through it plainly, point by point, the way he would have laid it before a judge. A man dead in 1865. Letters in his name from places that did not exist, every spring for 11 years, in a hand that was not his. He never once said the word cruel, and he did not need to. The facts, laid out in a row, made their own hard argument, and the room grew heavier as he went, until the only sound in it was the scratch of his pointer on the card, and, somewhere in the back, a child being hushed. And then, because someone in the room had murmured the thing everyone was feeling, Everett Dunn said the sentence that was the whole of his creed. A woman near the front had said it half aloud, but it was a kindness. Surely a body can see it was a kindness. Dunn turned, not unkindly himself, and answered her, and answered the whole room, in the level voice of a man who had thought this longer and harder than any of them. The law does not ask whether a lie was kind, ma'am. That is the one question the law is forbidden to ask, because every liar believes his own lie a kindness. And if we begin excusing the gentle ones, we have no rule left but our own soft hearts, and a soft heart is no protection at all to the next widow, and the next. I take no joy in this, but a thing is true, or it is not. These letters were not what they claimed to be. Everything else is feeling. He paused, and feeling is not evidence. It was, on its own terms, unanswerable. And into the silence after it, from the third row, a small old woman in a faded lavender bonnet stood up. I have not told you where Nell Prue was through all of this. She was at the front, alone, on a plain chair, and she had not said a word. She had refused a lawyer. She had refused to make a defense. When Dunn's case was done, they had asked her formally whether she wished to speak on her own behalf, and she had looked at her ink-stained hands in her lap and said, "No. Every figure he's given you is true. I'll not waste the room's time calling truth a lie." She had made up her mind, it seemed, to let the ledger have her, to pay. At 58, whatever the United States decided 11 springs of letters were worth. And to keep to the end the same silence she had kept the whole way through. She did not turn when the chair scraped behind her. She did not know yet that the one person she had spent 11 years protecting was about to do the thing she herself had never once allowed, to say it out loud. Abigail Merrill was 66 years old, and she stood up in that crowded hall as though she had been waiting 11 years to be asked. The room turned to her. Here was the woman at the center of his hall, poor Mad Abigail, the letter lady, the one they had pitied and mocked and finally stopped seeing. And she stood straight-backed and calm, the bundle of letters in her two hands, the sky blue ribbon gone white with age. And she was not mad at all, and every soul in the room understood it in the same instant, the way a room understands a change in the weather. Dunn, courteous even now, made to tell her she was not obliged to testify. She looked at him kindly, the way you look at a young man who has read a great many books. "I know I'm not obliged, son," she said. "I've been not saying this for 11 years. I believe I'll say it now." "You've got it near all right, Mr. Dunn," she said, "and you've got the heart of it exactly wrong. And it's a smaller thing than yours that tells me so. You found the letter T. I found something smaller. And I found it a long, long time ago." She opened the bundle with hands that did not hurry, and drew out a letter from near the bottom, one of the earliest, and held it up, though she had no need to read it. She had it by heart. "The third spring," she said, "the third letter. My Caleb, when he wrote a small G, he left the tail open, never closed the loop. I used to tease him it looked like a fishhook. And in the third letter, every G was closed. Neat, careful, a schoolteacher's G." She let it settle over the silent room. "I taught half of you in this hall your own letters. You think I would not know my own son's hand? I knew from the third letter that my boy did not write it. I knew, Mr. Dunn, before you were ever sent to this county, that the dead do not mail letters in the spring. So you will want to know why I kept reading them." She turned from Dunn to the room, to all of them, the whole town that had pitied her, because of what it meant. Think on it. Somewhere there was a person, I did not know who, for the longest while, and it did not matter, a person who had looked at an old woman with nothing left in the world, and decided she would not face one single spring without her boy's voice. A person who sat up in the dark and became my son one night a year for 11 years and asked nothing back, and let this whole town think ill of them rather than take the comfort away by explaining it. 11 springs, and never once a slip of the tongue, never once a look that gave it away, never once a hand held out for so much as a thank you. That is not a fraud, Mr. Dunn. A fraud takes. I was not robbed of one thing in 11 years. I was handed my son back every spring by someone who loved me enough to break their own heart quietly, in a back room, by a candle. I knew it was a gift. I took it with my eyes wide open. And I have come here today to say, out loud and before the law, that I received every letter that ever came to me, that each one reached the hand it was meant for and was welcome there, and that I would not give back a single spring of it to spare anybody the trouble of a hearing. For a moment no one moved, and then, from the back of the hall, the blacksmith stood up. Amos Teague was not a man who spoke in meetings. He turned his hat in his big hands, and he did not look at the inspector. He looked at Nell Prue's straight back. "My girl went out to Colorado in 71, he said, rough. Married bad. Can't read nor write, my Sadie. Every letter she sent me these 6 years, Nell read it out to me in the back of that office, quiet, and never charged me a cent nor told a living soul my Sadie's business. And every letter I sent back, Nell put my words down for me, because I can't." He stopped. "If that's fraud, then I don't want the mails honest. Put my name down under hers." Then it was as though a seam gave way. A grey widow rose 2 rows over. "My husband's last letter from Shiloh," she said. I could not make the words out for weeping, and Nell Prue read it to me 3 times over, standing right there, and it cost her the better part of an hour, and me nothing. "Put my name down." Before she was well seated, the schoolmaster was on his feet, a mild man in spectacles, not unlike the inspector's own. "I'll say the thing none of them have said plainly," he told the room. "Half the letters that leave this town in a year, Nell Prue has written, or set right. The courting letters, and the dunning letters, and the letters to sons gone west. This whole town speaks to the people it loves in Nell Prue's hand, and calls her cold behind her back. I'm ashamed it took a federal seal to make me stand up and say it. Put my name down with the rest." And then they were all standing. Not at once, and not on any signal. It went through the hall the way wind goes through wheat, one, and then a dozen, and then a whole field bowing the same way. The mercantile man stood. The miller and his wife stood. The children who had made the cruel rhyme stood because their mothers stood, and would understand it years later. Nobody shouted. It was the quietest uprising you ever saw, a church full of people getting to their feet in the mud light of an April morning to stand, at last and all together, on the side of the woman who had kept their post office counter for 30 years, and asked them for nothing. Nell Prue turned around in her chair then. She had held her face through all of it, through the arithmetic, through the word fraud on the door. She did not hold it through this. A whole town on its feet for her was the one thing 30 years had never taught her how to bear. Everett Dunn stood among all those standing people and looked down at his ruled tables, and his ruled tables looked, of a sudden, very small. He had built his life on a plain principle. That feeling is not evidence. And it was true. It was still true. But he saw now in that crowded hall the thing the principle had never had room for, that a fact can be entirely correct and still not be the truth of a matter. Every figure on his table was right, and every figure on his table was beside the point. And the point was standing on its feet, all around him, with its hat in its hands. He thought, he could not help it, of a letter of his own, years old unanswered, folded in a drawer in a city far to the east. A mother's hand, grown shaky at the end, asking after a son who was always too busy chasing other men's lies to come home and answer his own. A spring he had let go by, and then another, and then it was too late, and the last letter had come from a neighbor, not from her, and it had been thin. No one had sat up in any back room to spare Everett Dunn that empty spring. No one had ever loved him enough to tell him a single kind lie. He went back to his rented room that night, and he did not write the indictment. He took it out, the sheet with the 7 words, in the matter of the United States versus Nell Prue. And he read it over, and held it a while, and then he fed it to the stove and watched the seal blacken and curl. And on a clean sheet he wrote instead the shortest report of his career, in his small exact hand, and signed it. It read, "I find no fraud in the matter of Cottonwood Bend. Every article of mail was delivered to its rightful recipient, and received as intended. There is no injured party. The account is in balance." He looked at that last line a long time. Then, because he was after all a man who kept honest accounts, he took out one more sheet, a private one, not for the department, and began, 11 years too late. Dear Mother. He did not know if there was anyone left alive to read it. He wrote it anyway. Nell Prue had taught him, without ever once meaning to, that some letters are worth the writing even to the dead. He left Cottonwood Bend on a bright morning at the end of April, in the same black coach, with the red buds full out along the creek. The town made no show of his going, and he would not have wanted one. But as the coach came level with the post office, Everett Dunn had it stopped. He climbed down and went in and stood at the counter before Nell Prue one last time. The orderly man and the woman he had come 1,000 miles to charge. He did not offer his hand. He sensed she would not take it. He only took off his hat, which he had not done for a single other person in that town, and he inclined his head to her once, the way a man salutes a thing he has measured himself against and found the larger of the two. "Ma'am," he said. That was all. Then he put his hat back on and climbed up and rode east out of the story, a little less certain of his ledgers, and the better man for the loss of the certainty. That year, for the first time, Abigail Merrill did not walk to Decoration Day alone. It fell on the 30th of May, as it had since General Logan named it, and the town went out to the little cemetery on the rise to lay flowers on the graves of its soldiers. Caleb Merrill had a stone there over an empty place. His body was still in the Georgia ground, and every year his mother had knelt at it by herself, while the town gave her a wide and careful berth, the way you step around a person praying. This year she did not go straight up the rise. This year she stopped at the post office on her way and waited on the step in the bright morning. And when Nell Prue came out and locked the door behind her and found the widow standing there, the two of them walked up the rise together without much said, the letter lady and the postmistress. And this time it was the town that fell quiet and gave way, and no one in it thought the sight strange any longer. They knelt at the boy's stone together and laid the prairie violets down. For a long while neither one spoke. Then Abigail, not looking up, said the thing at last. "You wrote the G wrong." And Nell Prue, after a moment, said, "I know. I never could get it right. I used to lie awake over that G." "I know you did," said Abigail. "Third letter on, I knew that you knew that I knew. And you kept writing anyway." She put her old hand over the postmistress's ink-stained one. "That is the whole of why I let you. Now this story keeps honest accounts to the end, and the end has a hard truth in it. So hold on." Nell Prue died in the winter, some years on, alone in the 2 small rooms behind the post office, where she had lived her whole solitary life. The town buried her well. The whole county came and stood in the snow and meant it. But here is the hard truth, and the story will not soften it. In 58 years, no one had ever written Nell Prue a letter. Not one. She had given 1,000 people the words to reach the people they loved. She had forged 11 years of a dead boy's love for a lonely old woman. And in all that time, not a single soul had ever set down her name on an envelope and told her she was thought of. She died, having sent a great deal and received nothing. And if the account had closed there, it would have closed unbalanced, and this would be a colder story than the prairie deserves. But it did not close there. The next spring, on Decoration Day, they found something on the new grave at the edge of the cemetery. A letter. Cheap yellowed paper, folded in thirds, and inside it a single pressed prairie violet. The hand on it was an old woman's, an upright, careful hand, taught in a Kansas church hall 50 years before. And though no one read what was written there, they did not have to. Abigail Merrill had answered, at the last, the one correspondent who had never once written to her. She had sent the first letter of Nell Prue's whole life, one spring too late, and she would send another every spring she had left to her. They say on the prairie that grief shared is grief halved. That much the old people always knew. But there is a second half to the saying, and Cottonwood Bend learned it from two lonely women and a bundle of letters tied in a sky blue ribbon. That a letter answered is joy doubled, and that no one, not one soul on this hard earth, was ever meant to face a spring without one. And if you go through Cottonwood Bend today, long after both of them are gone, the last light down the length of the main street at night is not the candle in the widow's window anymore. It is the lamp on the post office counters I left burning, they will tell you, for anyone still out on the road, so that no letter and no soul carrying one need ever pass a dark house again.